Hi guys, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown. We're live on Twitch and we are talking about the new cards from the upcoming set Into Shadow, or the upcoming campaign Into Shadow, rather. There's going to be, the usual 16 to 12 new cards. Actually, I don't remember the precise number, but we're going to be looking at the story of Vara as she ventures further into the Shadowlands. It should be a lot of fun, and there have been two new cards that have been shown off on LSV's stream, so we're going to go into them, talk about each of them, and sort of go into a breakdown. They're actually both recursive cards, or rather cards that encourage recursion and repetition in ways that are somewhat fun. And these cards tend to have a lot of strength if you are playing Silver Control decks, because the ability to repeat certain effects, if they are good effects, can be really, really powerful if you're, like in a lot of situations. Basically, it just reduces the variance in decks and it makes it a little bit easier to play out certain cards more often. The first one is going to be one of the more interesting ones. They're both really cool, but let's go ahead and talk about the first one first, Tome of Repetition. And yeah, it looks like our opener is all set up. Oh, hang on a sec. Let me get my background to where it's supposed to be. There we go. Okay, so yeah, we don't have the transparent images of the cards, but we'll go ahead and put Tome of Repetition out there, and let's see what we can say about this. So Tome of Repetition does two things. First, it gives you the ability to use spellcraft abilities an additional time. This should apply when the weapon is played, so it applies to Tome of Repetition's spellcraft on its own, which is pretty important stuff. Like, you do want to actually be able to use Tome of Repetition as a 2, a 4, or a 6. So when you play Tome of Repetition, it allows you to also spellcraft for 2 to play Secret Pages, which is, of course, a card that allows you to play a power depleted from your deck, regardless of extra power. It's a ramp card that usually costs 3. Okay, so there's a couple of good things about this card. First off, it is a 4-cost card that ramps for 1, which there are a couple of those. Azindel, Memento Mori, and now Tome of Repetition are all in that slot. And it turns out that, in time, I've generally found that having ramp cards at any particular setup, if they also do other things, can be really, really useful. Tome of Repetition has some interesting synergy with a bunch of spellcraft stuff, which is good stuff. And it also allows us to basically just give some other unit that we have a little bit of extra health and a little bit of extra strength. So playing it at 2 is probably not going to be a thing that you really want to do, but playing it at 4 is very, very good, and playing it at 6 is really interesting too, because you get to just double ramp 2 power out of your deck and immediately jump to 8, which is crazy fun times. That's your channel setup, that's your Sword of the Sky King. Basically all of the really, really big control finishers cost 8. So playing Tome of Repetition just as a way to get from 6 to 8 is not a bad idea and can do a lot of crazy things. It should be noted this card works really well with Empower type effects, where you want to, if you play this on an Awakened student, for example, then you give it +1/+2, and then you give it an additional +2/+2 for the 2 power that you've played, while also buffing all of your other Empower units and making just a pile of interesting Empower effects happen. On something like Civic Peacekeeper, you can just stun 3 units at a time. If there's some sort of big Empower effect, like if you're trying to play, I don't know, the 7-cost 5/5 that plays Pillar of Amar, I believe it's called, you can just play Sentinel after Sentinel after Sentinel, get a lot of Empower effects all at once. And so that's kind of neat. The nice thing about the spellcraft ability in particular is that it gives you a lot of extra power to play basically a pile of spellcraft weapons, which is good times if you want to use cards like Vanquisher's Blade, which is already very good, Sword of Unity. Big Combre kind of really loves Tome of Repetition for silly things. And if you're playing the Horde Plunderer deck where you get to spellcraft for free, then Tome of Repetition can be played basically on 5 to ramp to 7 or 8 and also get possibly a bunch of free stuff on the next turn. The ability of Tome of Repetition to play out just a pile of interesting spellcraft stuff is it's really, really cool. There's a lot of stuff to work with there. That is just interesting areas to play around with. So in terms of like fun decks, I think there's definitely some potential for it. Like Horde Plunderer's got some good options. You got some good interesting Combre stuff with Empower. You have lots of like sort of spell-based decks and spellcraft-based decks. I actually think that spellcraft is really interesting because it creates spells out of nothing, which allows you to play more spell-focused themes while also actually focusing on the board and focusing on your units. So you can just like make big units and also get like the necessary stuff into your void to play, for example, Moment of Creation, or something along the lines of like maybe if you're doing like a Caldera Cradle type deck, anything along those lines where you're just creating and generating lots of extra spells and extra value makes whatever it is that you target with Tome of Repetition a very important target to remove for your opponent. And since the card gives a little bit of extra health to that card, that's pretty effective stuff. Yeah, I would say this card most likely belongs in Elysian most of all, just because of its ability to be very good on Aegis units, and to play around with Horde Plunderer, which both of those things make it pretty effective. A changey stick that double polymorphs is pretty crazy. The ability to just like play out a 2-drop and then turn 2 other things into frogs is, yeah, like that's pretty nuts stuff. The Combre setup has probably the better spellcraft weapons, but of course you don't get to quite be as abusive. I do think that there is some potential there, and there might be a very good Combre spellcraft deck. The question, however, is whether or not that Combre spellcraft deck is going to be the equivalent of a lot of the Combre decks that are currently out there, like TJ Alessi, or anything along those lines where you're using a lot of Combre aggro, or even the big like mid-range setups. Because in those situations, like, the big thing about Combre is they have a lot of bombs, they have a lot of ramp, and they have a lot of, like, really efficient ways to both get to big things and also play those big things. Infinite value Time has in spades, so while I think this card definitely is fun in Combre, I'm curious to see if it's going to have a meta impact in those Combre decks. It's certainly got some potential for it, but I'm not sure if it's going to be, like, an A+ tier 1 card in those situations. Mostly, this card looks like a lot of silly fun, and yeah, I think that there is definitely a Horde Plunderer deck or a couple of spellcraft decks that should be pretty good tier 2 options with it. It seems interesting, and I'm pretty excited to play with it a little bit. Our other card is also about recursion, or repetition, although in this case we're actually setting up some repetition. And this one's a little bit dangerous. I'm actually very curious to see if this ends up causing some problems overall. So this is Messenger Hawk. It's a 1-cost 0/1 with flying, and it says summon, choose a card in your hand, create 4 copies of it, and put them into your deck. I've been looking for a card just like this one in Primal for like 4 sets now, so I'm super happy to see it. I was surprised by how cheap this card is. It is really easy to play. You can play it on turn 1, which is a turn in Primal where you usually aren't really doing anything, and then you can immediately set up to just create a bunch of copies of a unit and put them into your deck. Now, the law of firebombs applies. Playing a bunch of units into your deck or playing a bunch of cards into your deck does not really dramatically improve your chances of drawing those cards, or indeed like make it so that you can actually get like a ton of them overall. But if you're the kind of deck that actually does do a lot of card draw and does do a lot of like other types of things that you are like basically setting up bigger stuff, for example the Curiox control deck, then yeah, like there are actually a lot of cards that you can put into your deck to make your deck a lot more powerful. And if indeed you select one of your bombest bombs with Messenger Hawk early on, then Messenger Hawk is definitely going to be something that is going to be really beneficial later on. Someone was joking about using this with Champion of Cunning and Feln, because Champion of Cunning is just Feln's best 5-drop. I actually don't think that's crazy. Like, Feln really wants to draw Champion of Cunning. It has a ton of draw effects and a ton of stall effects and a ton of overall like removal-based effects, and then every time it plays Champion of Cunning, it forces your opponent to play out a bunch of units to deal with it. So the more Champion of Cunning as you're drawing, the better off you are. Like, there are certainly situations where Messenger Hawk might be on the strong side in those types of decks. Like, I think it's pretty crazy stuff. Now, obviously, all the silly stuff applies. Play this with Clockroaches, you're super happy with it. The card that I actually really really want to play this with, and the reason that I'm really happy to finally see a version of this card printed, is Static Bolt. I love Static Bolts. I have always wanted to see more cards that actually make Static Bolt good, and Messenger Hawk is definitely one of those cards. If you play Static Bolts in your deck as removal, if you're doing Static Bolt based strategies with Second Sight and other types of like recursive effects, and doing like the actual, I mean, we are very, very fond of the Carpet Shuffle, even though that card has been nerfed into the ground, but this is a particular setup that actually does improve on the Static Bolt game and allow us to deal more damage with Static Bolts and play draw-based effects that actually give us a control-based Static Bolt deck. So that's something that I'm really excited about. Like, I would like to just draw like 12 Static Bolts and eventually get a Static Bolt that deals 12 damage and win the game with it. That's something that appeals to me as an Eternal player. It's something that I'm really, really happy to see. So yeah, I like it, and I'm very, very excited to play with this card. What else can we do? So we talked about Clockroaches. Any sort of relic that has a really, really unique effect, or any sort of card that has a really, really unique effect if you draw multiple copies of it, is always certainly welcome. Like if you're just using Messenger Hawk to put Xenon Obelisk into your, or put 4 copies of Xenon Obelisk into your hand, into your deck, that is a really strong play. Like Messenger Hawk needs something to actually buff it up so that it can be a card on board. And this is something we should talk about. Like this is a card that does have an inherent trap in it where the Messenger Hawk does not do anything. So unless you have some way to eventually sort of inconsequentially, like without much effort, enable Messenger Hawk to be a card that is scary, or use Messenger Hawk in some way, then every time that you play a Messenger Hawk, you're essentially getting rid of a card worth of advantage to improve upon your deck. And we've seen this trap before. Like there is a 1-cost card that shuffles 6 6s with Aegis for 2, called the Ancients. And that card's not strong at all. Light the Fuse puts a bunch of cards into your opponent's deck. That card's really, really bad. Like these kinds of cards are really, really tricky. The thing about Messenger Hawk is that it does have a body. So if you're putting something like an Obelisk in there, or if you're actually like creating something, an extra unit or body to devour for Shadow, if you're doing something with the Hawk, then you don't lose card advantage in the way that these other cards do. And that is pretty powerful stuff. Like, so, like, this is really, really cheap. It definitely benefits Primal in a lot of interesting ways. I think it's a very strong Primal card just because Primal does not have a lot of 1-drops that are worth playing. And Messenger Hawk is certainly a pretty strong one, assuming that you can find some other things to synergize with it. Even if it's something like, I'm going to play a Beast Colors Amulet on this on 3, because I need a small flying body. Like, if there are reasons to play Messenger Hawk outside of the summon effect, then Messenger Hawk ends up being a pretty appealing choice for that early game, because we are actually getting something for nothing, or we're getting some sort of benefit to our deck, and then we also just have like a little unit that we can maybe do something cool with. So I think the options for this are like really, really high. Like there's a ton of different ways that you can put this into different decks. It might be a pretty powerful Primal card, and that actually worries me a little bit, because the thing about Messenger Hawk is that it does create somewhat repetitive situations. It creates situations where you are playing the same card over and over again, consistently more often. Like if Ikaria Blue was just a deck that played like Messenger Hawks and got more Ikarias, I don't think that's going to happen, because you don't need 8 Ikarias, and there's no reason to actually have 8 Ikarias in your deck. Like, if you get one with Rise of the Challenge, you're good. But, like, if Messenger Hawk is, like, grabbing a bunch of Rises or something like that, like, maybe that's something that could be, like, really scary. So, like, you have to be careful with this, because there is some potential for it to get just cards that are already good and sort of reinforce those cards in the meta. I assume this card has been pretty significantly tested, so I'm guessing that it's not actually that powerful, mostly just because it is a card down for benefit that you aren't really getting. But if it ever becomes a card that is good in the meta, that could create problems overall. So that's something to really keep an eye on in terms of the design. I'm really happy to see this card because I love it. Like there's a lot of things that you can do with this, but it can be degenerate. So this is something that we want to watch. Overall, yeah, it doesn't seem like it's a great card in terms of like overall power level. It's an amazing card in terms of hijinks, and I can see myself playing this in all sorts of different Primal decks. I'm very, very excited about it, and we're going to have a lot of fun with it. So those are the 2 cards for today. To the YouTube folks, thank you very much for watching, and we'll be talking about more cards very, very soon from the upcoming set. They've just announced that you can, there's some new things going on with this one. You can actually buy it as a premium set if you want to for 2,000 gems, and you'll get, instead of just like all of the cards from the the card rewards will be premium, and you'll also get a premium Vara avatar. So that's an interesting new thing that they've added. Like, obviously the story is going to be pretty cool, and I'm guessing this is going to be released right around the same time that Eternal is released, which I'm very, very excited about. So yeah, like, this is going to be a really, really cool set. It's already got 3 cards that I'm very, very interested in, and I'm looking forward to like actually setting up with it. It's, I think, 25,000 gold or 1,000 gems. So look forward to that, and yeah, we're gonna have ourselves a really, really fun time with it. Have a really good night, everyone, and I will see you next time.